Hello, and I'm Sian Errington. I'm going to be chairing today's session, and welcome everyone to this event with Michael Roberts on Lenin as an economist. So today is the latest in the Lenin 100 series. Thousands of you have already registered for discussions on Lenin and Ireland, Lenin series of Imperialism, and many others. This event, like the others, is being broadcast on YouTube. So I really do encourage you to watch back the last event with Paul LeBlanc, which you can find on the YouTube channel, and where this event can be found afterwards as well. So if you enjoy it, you can share it with your friends and family. Please register for our future events to get updates, and if you can, buy a ticket for the whole series and help us support this kind of series of important discussions. Today's, as I said, is on Lenin as an economist. I think it's not just an interesting topic, but it's a really crucial one in a world where we face multiple crises rooted in our economic system. So in the series as a whole, we're aiming to look at Lenin's dynamic revolutionary thought, how he worked as part of a larger collective, how he centered the labour movement in that work, and how his radical understanding of democracy took hold. And we're looking at it because looking at these ideas and theories and the actions that were taken can also help to inform and transform our activism today. As we've highlighted before in this series, Lenin was one of the most brilliant minds and organisers drawn to our international socialist movement. He was an outstanding theorist and organiser who had innovative ideas in a number of areas, including, of course, the classic analysis, imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, and innovative ideas behind the new economic policy, which Michael's going to be touching on today. At a time when understanding of how the capitalist economy works seems at a bit of a low level, and when we're in a long depression, and we are told that an orthodoxy that punishes the majority is the only way forward, taking a bit of time out on a lovely Sunday afternoon to reflect on and understand capitalism from a Marxist point of view, use this as a framework for analysing the world around us and what a socialist economic policy could look like is very much needed. So I am really, really pleased to be joined today by Michael Roberts, who is a Marxist economist. He worked in the city for many years. He wrote The Great Recession in Marxist view in 2009. He also wrote The Long Depression 2016, Marx 200, a review of Marx's economics in 2018, and many other texts. He also blogs regularly at the Next Recession WordPress blog, which I really encourage people to look up after this event. We're going to be taking questions and comments from the audience after Michael has done his introductory discussion. So we've got volunteers facilitating that on the YouTube chat function. So, and we're going to be taking questions as soon as Michael's finished his talk. So start thinking of them now, post them as we go along, and we will put them to him later on in this talk. I'm going to quickly remind you also, while you're listening, to maybe think about donating to our friends at Arise, who have kindly lent us their YouTube channel for this event, and also keep an eye on the links that are going to be posted in the chat box, because you'll also see like ways of buying a ticket for the Lenin 100 series. And if you tell us where you are, then I will do you a shout out later on. So before I do any more plugs or anything, I'm going to hand straight over to Michael, who's going to kick us off. Michael.
Thanks, Sian. Thank you, Arise, for inviting me to speak on Lenin's economics. Obviously, there are many faceted features of Lenin's activities, as the chair has already described to us. But perhaps an area which is less well known is his contribution to Marxist economics and his critique of capitalism in general. So I'm just going to do 3 or 4 key elements of what I consider as Lenin's contribution to Marxist economics in this short presentation. I'm going to miss out a few things, unfortunately, so no doubt you may be able to pick them up on questions. but I hope this will at least provide us with the basis of what I think are the key points. To do that, Michael Roberts always presents slides, so I'm just going to share those things with you when I've got it sorted. So, starting off Lenin's economics on the 100th anniversary of his premature death. I mean by that he died obviously fairly young, if not more or less the average age at the time, certainly young for now. And here we are 100 years later, considering not only his economics, but a number of other things in this series that you've been doing with. But just before I do the economics, I think it's just to explain to you the 4 points that I'm going to present to you as my main themes. Lenin's view on the development of capitalism, Lenin's view on imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism, Lenin's view on what happens for the economics of a worker state surrounded by imperialism, what economic strategy had to be adopted or should be adopted, and also something which isn't usually discussed when you come to Lenin's economics, that is Lenin's view on the nature of knowledge and how that relates to work. So just a quick look at Lenin as a person. He was born, as we say, 100 years ago in a family home in Simbirsk. You see top left, that's his family home. A sizable, fairly well-off family, 8 children, several sisters and brothers. From, as I'll explain a bit later, you can see how he looked at 15, and then as a student activist later on. And then once he joined various Marxist groups at the age of mid-20s onwards, and the group of Marxist groups, and then as leader of Russian social democracy, it was called then, in the early 1900s, and of course in 1917 as leader of the Bolshevik majority social democratic government that came to power through a revolution and insurrection in October, November 1917. What about Lenin the man? Well, he was born into an upper middle class family, as I said. His original name, Lenin, of course, being a pseudonym or alias, was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and he was the third of 8 children. His father, Ilya, was a former serf, but had risen up to middle class status by studying mathematics and physics at university, and then becoming teaching at an institute for the nobility, and eventually became sort of head of the public schools in his particular area. His mother came from a wealthy Swedish family. Ilya attained this job and became director of primary schools in his area and received a knighthood, the equivalent of a knighthood or even a baronetcy that we would have now as a result of his work from the Tsarist government. And so you could call him a minor noble by the time Lenin reached the age of 12 or 13. When he was 15, Lenin's father died, and at that point he renounced his belief in God. And his elder brother, Alexander, who'd already become a radical and political agitator at his university, actually organized with another group a conspiracy to assassinate the Tsar and selected to construct a bomb. But before the attack could take place, of course, the Tsarist intelligence agencies were on the ball, had them all arrested. And so Lenin's elder brother was executed in May 1887. That completely radicalized Lenin further. At university, took place in many demonstrations against government restrictions on societies. The police arrested him, to expelled from university, sent first at home to his family's estate, and eventually also sent further away for a period of 3 years. It was only really in the 1890s he was able to come back and participate in reading on Marxist Capital for the first time and develop his interest in Marxism. After that, he was basically, from the 1890s, he worked to get some work, barrister's assistant, and then took a senior position in the Social Democratic Party and became a leading member of the Social Democrats by the late 1890s, and then going into exile like many others did as emigres in the early 1900s when the Tsarists applied further restrictive measures against opposition. So this period that I'm talking about of economics is when Lenin's already established himself as a fairly experienced, developed Russian Marxist in opposition to other forms of opposition to the regime and also towards liberal economics and so on. And so the key first theme that Marx takes up, Lenin takes up, is a big argument against what were called the Narodniks, who were a group of radical revolutionaries who saw that the only way to get Russia out of the hands of Tsarism was to rely on the peasantry, to hope that the peasantry would take Tsarist Russia forward to some form of socialism or communism based on rural communes, that it would bypass capitalism. Capitalism was not going to develop in Russia because it was so backward, and therefore this was the only way forward. Now, Lenin wrote a book in 1899 called The Development of Capitalism in Russia, where he spent a lot of time painstakingly outlining how capitalism was developing in Russia, that there was a breakup of the peasants between the poorer ones and the richer ones, and there was also development of industrialization beginning to take place in the cities, that the form that capitalism had taken in the west of Europe and in the United States was also beginning to take place in Russia, that we saw the same developments, although, of course, the peasantry remained 80% of the population. But even in the agricultural areas, even in the rural areas, we're beginning to see a development of a rural capitalist and a more landless rural proletariat, and the idea of peasantry being one common group beginning to disappear, and the inequalities that we'd expect with the development of capitalism beginning to form. That was Lenin's historical view that he presented to in his book, in opposition to the position of the Narodniks. But one of the key points he makes theoretically, and I hope you can follow this, if only briefly, is he wants to make the point that Marx makes in Volume 2 Capital, that capitalism can work. It doesn't collapse. And the argument presented by the Narodniks and by many people around Marx at the time was that capitalism would go into a breakdown because the workers couldn't buy back all the goods that had been produced by capitalist industries by the workers. And that argument presented, therefore, what is called an underconsumption theory, namely that there's not enough workers to buy all the goods, and therefore capitalism will collapse. Well, clearly capitalism doesn't collapse. So how does capitalism manage to find sales for its goods when workers can't buy all the goods that they produce? And in Volume 2 of Capital, Marx makes it clear that we should really look at two parts to the capitalist economy. Department 1, which is capitalists selling to other capitalists for producer goods, various intermediate components, raw materials, and so on, and capitalists in Department 2 selling to consumers, workers, and so on, and of course for luxuries to the capitalists themselves. And if you do a simple reproduction model, you find that you can make capitalism work in the sense that the amount of capital required in the second department, the consumer sector, can be financed by the amount of extra new value created in the producer good or capitalist goods sector. So that 100 plus 150 in Department 1 adds up to the 250 in Department 2 that they need for the capital fixed assets and machinery and raw materials in order to produce the consumer goods. So a simple formula of simple reproduction is C2 equals V1 plus S1. Now, all that Marx was saying in Volume 2, and Lenin emphasizes again, is capitalism does not collapse because there's underconsumption. It can find a way to sell the goods that consumers don't buy, namely to other capitalists. And that's the formula for simple reproduction that does that. When a capitalist economy grows and expanded production, then there will tend to be more money, more value invested into Department 1, that's the investment sector, the investment producer goods. That will exceed the amount that invested in Department 2. And so you get an increase in Department 1 relative to Department 2, which doesn't happen under simple reproduction, only when you start to expand the economy. But that's nothing special about that, says Marx and Lenin. This is what happens when a capitalist economy expands. Money is saved by the capitalists in profit, and they invest it in new equipment, new factories, new production areas, rather than just try to produce more goods. And they take that extra value they've got from workers in order to do that. So logically possible that production can take place for the sake of production and to an increasing degree. And this is how capitalist economies expand and reproduce and go forward. So Lenin's making the point which Marx made before, that the Narodniks are on. Capitalism can expand, it can develop, and it can develop in Russia as well. So nothing could be more senseless, says Lenin, than to conclude from Capital that Marx did not admit the possibility of surplus value being realized in capitalist society, that he attributed crises to underconsumption and so forth. So Lenin and Marx denying that crises are caused by underconsumption. This is important for us to remember, because even now there's a large body of opinion, including within the socialist and labour movement, that that's what causes crisis, the fact that workers don't have enough wages to pay for all the goods. But that's not the basic reason that Marx and Lenin were put forward for crises. It's a different factor, not the question of whether the means of production are outstripping the availability of consumption. It's perfectly possible for supply to grow faster in Department 1 than Department 2 and not cause a shortfall in demand, as Rosa Luxemburg thought. An investment demand could grow faster than consumer demand, and yet supply and demand in each department can remain balanced over time. As Marx said, there would be no capitalist production at all if it had to develop simultaneously and evenly in both those spheres. Now, the second key contribution, and probably the biggest one that Lenin's made that we still remember, for those who have done a little bit of reading on this, is Lenin's book written in 1915, Imperialism, the Latest Stage of Capitalism, sometimes called the Highest Stage of Capitalism. The original title was The Latest Stage. And there are 5 key points that Lenin makes. This is now, as leader of the Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party, looking at the world situation at the beginning of the 20th century. The first is Lenin makes in the book is that concentration and centralization of capital developed to such a stage that increasingly we have huge monopoly companies, not a load of small companies competing against each other, but huge monopolies beginning to dominate the world and the international position as a whole. Secondly, increasingly industrial capital and bank capital or finance capital is merged together. We have an oligarchy, which we obviously know about now, with the big investment banks and the big companies all linked together in organizing and controlling the vast majority of capitalist investment decisions. This is now the position. No longer were these two sectors of capitalism completely separate. They had merged together in this period of the early 20th century. And also, no longer was it just a question of developing capital at home in the domestic market in the United States, the UK, and Europe. Increasingly now, capitalists were exporting their capital abroad, not just trading abroad and buying and selling more commodities, buying commodities from the poorer parts of the world and selling manufactures to them, but now they were exporting finance, building factories, building railroads, building bridges and so on around the world, particularly in areas where they had colonial power. So we begin to see the export of capital as a key feature of this latest stage of capitalism. So we have also the formation of big capitalist associations who try to share the world out amongst themselves, agreements about, well, you get India, we get West Africa, and so on. Of course, none of these things were kept to all the time, but that development of the world being divided up amongst the big imperialist powers now, the modern imperialist powers of the early 20th century, controlling the rest of the world. So the territorial division of the whole world is now broken up between the biggest capitalist powers. And this process is more or less completed by the time of the second decade of the 20th century. So that was the basic point that Lenin makes in the points that he makes in the latest stage of capitalism. He argued that imperialism was result then of capitalism's need to export capital, not just trade, but now need to export capital, which arises from the fact that in a few countries, capitalism has become overripe. And owing to the backward state of agriculture and the poverty of the masses, capital cannot find a field for profitable investment. So Lenin's saying imperialism has got an economic basis. What drives export of capital is to look for profit, better profit abroad that they could find at home. So the competition for profitable investment between different capitalist powers now takes place on the international arena and not just at home between different capitalist companies. Now, that doesn't really explain why there's more bigger profit in the poorer countries of the world compared to the profitability in the domestic imperialist economies. Later on, a Marxist economist called Henrik Grossman in the 1920s went further than Lenin and said, why are profitable investments not to be found at home? The fact of capital export is as old as modern capitalism itself. The scientific task is to explain why there's been a change in this role and the mechanism of capitalist production takes place. And his argument was, of course, that the profitability of capital at home in Britain, the United States, and Europe was beginning to fall. And this forced the big multinational companies, as they developed, to export capital abroad and look for better profitability bases in the poorer countries of the world. And we can see here is a graph that I've had in my book, The Long Depression, which outlines how the rate of profit was going in the UK. J. Arthur Lewis, who was a very good economic historian of the early part of the 20th century, says, look, in the low level of profits in the last quarter of the century, meaning the 19th century, we have an explanation which is powerful enough to explain the retardation of industrial growth in the 1880s and 1890s. And you can see here, if you look at the black line, you can see a big fall in the rate of profit in Britain in the period of the 1880s, 1870s, and 1880s. And that fall forced British capital to look to export capital abroad, and it helped to drive up that rate of profit towards the First World War as a result. And so what we see here is that the driving force behind imperialist expansion was on the basis of economics, on the basis of export of capital, and on the basis of trying to find a higher rate of profit than they were no longer getting at home. So that position, which is partially, if not mostly, explained by Lenin in his book, has been added to by others since. So modern imperialism now, in the 21st century, is really an economic system. It's no longer just taking over a country with an army and setting up your own colonial regime. That has more or less disappeared in all the countries. It wasn't the case, obviously, in the 18th and 19th centuries, but now it is. Modern imperialism is very much an economic mechanism, not a political one. Its basic aim is not political dominance, but economic exploitation. And through economic exploitation, then you can achieve political dominance. So imperialist countries really can be defined as those who have got the highest number of technologically advanced companies, which are able to compete better than the poorer countries of the world and their companies, and as a result to extract value, surplus value from the poor countries to them through trade and through investment. On the right-hand side, that shows how much 1% of GDP every year is going to the imperialist countries just from trade from the poorer countries of the world. So if you know that the imperialist countries on average are growing at about 2% a year at the moment, 1% of that is due to the fact of exploitation from the so-called third world or the global south. So all that comes, I think, as an extrapolation and development of what Lenin said in his very good and important book, Imperialism in the Latest Stage of Capitalism. One of the other things that Lenin mentions in this period is the development he's felt through imperialism of the possibility of the most advanced capitalist economies and imperialist economies to be able to extract so much surplus value from the poor countries that they could use this to buy off sections of the labor part of the working class, in particular the labor movement, the trade unions, and so on. And as Engels said as early as 1858, the English proletariat, because Britain was the leading capitalist power of the mid-19th century, a section of the proletariat had been bought off, a sort of aristocracy of labor had developed. And Lenin says that that's the danger too in the tendency of imperialism to split the workers, to strengthen opportunism among them and cause decay in the working class movement. Now, do we have a labor aristocracy now? That's a question that perhaps we could discuss if we have time, because you could say that certainly in the case of Britain, it's no longer the leading power in the world, economically or politically. And so we can see that the ability for them to buy off sections of the labor movement at the top with better conditions and wages and so on no longer exists. Does that still apply, say, to the United States or not? It's a question that we could consider. Finally, on the question of imperialism, what Lenin said in 1915, he outlined a number of countries which were the leading imperialist powers. Looking at the evidence now, those imperialist powers at the early part of the 20th century are still exactly the same imperialist powers as they are now. You can see them. If you look at the red ones, those are the top G7 economies. That's wealth per capita. The blue ones are some of the other advanced or imperialist powers, smaller ones like Sweden, Netherlands, and so on. But if you go over to the right, you can see that the countries that can't be considered, in my view, imperialist, do not have really much wealth per capita at all. The gap between the top imperialist powers, particularly the G7, and the major poorer countries, even if they're large, whether they're China, Brazil, India, and so on, is still huge. So imperialism has been able to stop the development of capitalism and the development of the productivity of labor and technology in these poorer countries by the usurping of majority control of the economy, particularly through trade, investment, and finance. The same imperialist powers that took control in 1915 are still in control 100 years later. Now, I'll quickly move on to the question of the Soviet Union. Let me just say that after the revolution in 1917, I'm sure some of you will be aware, the establishment of the Bolshevik government, the Social Democratic government in 1917 and into 1918 was met with a massive attack, counter-revolutionary attack, not only by forces within the Russia and the other surrounding countries that became the Soviet Union, but also outside from the north and east Europe, and the whole of Siberia was cut off. Bolsheviks were isolated. They were forced to sign a humiliating treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in order to avoid invasion by Germany, and this led to the complete encirclement of the Bolshevik and Soviet government to a very small area in the 1918-1919 period. That's the, if you like, the real Russian tragedy, because at the very beginning of the revolution, the Soviet Union was isolated. The possibility of spreading the revolution to Germany, to France, and to the West was the key aim of the Bolsheviks. That's what they hoped would save the Soviet Union, and now a federation of socialist states in Europe to develop the economy in the interests of working people. But in the meantime, they had to fight a vicious civil war against reactionary forces and invasion by up to 15 countries invaded, 24 different armies, and that forced them to adopt the most extreme measures of what was then called war communism. As Lenin outlined in his pamphlet, The Impending Catastrophe and How to Combat It, in these emergency conditions of civil war and famine, we had to increase the regulation and control of the state. We had to control the labor force, and that meant even against the interests of the trade unions as such. We had to amalgamate and take control of state banks and all the banks and the big capitalist firms. And we introduced a system of planning for the first time, rather than relying upon the market. Because right up until the period of the war communism, even beyond, the vast majority of the economy was either in the hands of the peasants or in the hands of small companies, not in the hands of the big firms, which the government and the state had to take control of, which they eventually did. So we had a policy and a change of that reaction. That wasn't the original aim of the Bolshevik government to take these things over immediately, but they were forced to do so in this situation, and they're forced to apply quite severe conditions upon the peasants in order to get resources, food, and so on, to conduct the war, and also to feed the workers in the cities where they were still in the cities, because most of them had to go to the front to fight the war. This was a shockingly difficult situation between 1918 and 1921. It produced opposition to the Bolshevik government, even from sections of workers in the course of that. And that led to the forcing of eventually of the government to change its policy altogether from this severe collectivist enforced policy of directing food and controlling the economy this way. And once the defeat of the international forces had been achieved and the reactionary forces by 2021, Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership decided they had to go change the policy. They called this the new economic policy. They decided to bring back capitalism for some sections. Peasants were then allowed to sell surplus grain for profit, but paying a tax on what they produce, and small factories were handed back into private ownership. The most important industries, however, were still controlled by the state. This was a relatively successful policy. War was over. They were able to see an expansion of agricultural production as the peasants began to sell surplus grain for profit, but getting some money revenues back from the peasants accordingly. And so this was, as Lenin called it, to quote him here, owing to our cultural backwardness, we cannot crash capitalism by a frontal attack. Had we been on a different cultural level, we could have approached the problem more directly. Perhaps other countries will do it in this way when their turn comes to build their communist republics, but we can't do it in this direct way. So the state must learn to trade in such a way that industry satisfies the needs of the peasantry, so that the peasantry may satisfy their needs by means of trade. We must see to it that everyone who works devotes himself to strengthening the workers' and peasant state. Only then will we be able to create large-scale industry and a move away from our technological and cultural backwardness. So this was a step back from all-out planned economy, everything nationalized, producing for the population directly. Instead, they moved back to a market economy, particularly in agriculture, and even in the small businesses, and only the commanding heights, the big companies and industries and the banks remained in the hands of the state. This created eventually a problem by the late 1923, because what happened was, while the peasants were getting more money by selling grain surpluses and so on, there was beginning to be a division between rich peasants and poor peasants, but also it meant that because industry was being starved of funds, because everything had been directed towards the peasantry for a period of time in order to restore their support, it meant that prices of industrial goods, consumer goods arose sharply in the cities and so on. So workers who were working in industries were facing dire situation. And on the other hand, also peasants couldn't buy any of these consumer goods with their money because they were too highly priced. This was called the scissors crisis, where the industrial prices rose more than agricultural prices. And this gap between the two, this divergence, which reached a very high level by towards the end of 1923, meant the peasants' incomes fell. They couldn't buy manufactured goods, and workers were also beginning to starve in the cities and couldn't even find employment. So there had to be, again, an end to this policy. There's a big argument between within the Bolshevik leadership and what direction to take. Some took the view they had to continue with new economic policy for further. There was no alternative because there was no revolution abroad, and this was the only way to develop the economy, while others disagreed and said this was the time to start reducing the position for the peasantry and industrializing the economy by finding resources through the state to expand industry in a form of socialist accumulation in the cities and building that up. So we got a division between the idea that we should continue with NEP, or we should move towards industrializing the Russian economy through extracting more surplus from the peasantry to finance the industrial sector. This was called by one of the Bolshevik economists, Preobrazhensky, primitive socialist accumulation. This became the big argument within the Bolshevik party. Which way did Lenin go on this question? Well, it's difficult to say, but broadly, I think he would say by the time he came towards his death, he was going towards the direction of industrializing the Russian economy and increasing the taxes upon the peasantry to do that. And so reducing the inequalities developing within NEP. But that's a matter for discussion. Lenin obviously died in March 24, so the solution to this problem didn't arise for him. The debate went on for another 5 or 6 years. And of course, as we know, most of the Bolshevik leadership was removed and is killed off by Stalin and his supporters, who continue with the policy of NEP right up to 1928. Now, the reason I raise NEP is that in China, we have perhaps a model which is something similar. You want to think about that. Do we have a model where you have the state in control of the big banks, the big industries, the most important sectors of the economy industrially, but the peasants or the communes and the small peasants or agricultural farmers can build their own, make their own money from sale, and also the big capitalist sector in industrial sector as well in China has developed. Now, that happened from 1978 when Deng Xiaoping took over as leader in China, and he said the most correct model of socialism was the new economic policy of the USSR. Now, that raises a question. Lenin saw that as a retreat, not something you would maintain. Deng is now putting it forward in 1978 as a permanent way forward for the Chinese economy. I've lots a long quote here in 2009, well, from a book in 2009, about which I think sums up Deng's position. The policies of using foreign funds and allowing the private sector to expand will not weaken the predominant position of the public sector, which is the basic feature of the economy. On the contrary, those policies are intended in the last analysis to develop the productive forces more vigorously and strengthen the public sector. So long as the public sector plays a predominant role in China's economy, polarization, by that inequality and so on, and the power of the capitalists can be avoided. Well, that's a debate, again, that we've continued in the 21st century. Does China have some sort of long net policy? Is that the correct one? How is that working out in terms of the contradictions in the Chinese economy? Finally, guys, I know I've gone a bit long. Here's an area which really isn't discussed about Lenin's economics. He wrote a book much earlier, 1909, called Materialism and Imperialism. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's a philosophical work in which he wants to present the nature of knowledge and the question of matter in general. And this is a big argument, of course, in Marxist philosophy against the view of idealism and so on, that everything is material and should be seen that way, and that even mental thoughts are material. Let me explain. Lenin said that the mastery of nature is manifested in human practice of an objective current reflection in the human head of the phenomena and processes of nature. So he's saying here that what we think in our minds is a reflection of a reality which really exists. So if we're dead or if we're unconscious, it's still there. It's not a product of our mind. Our mind merely reflects the material objects which exist in the world. That's a fundamental point about materialism against idealism. Now, that can be argued as a good first step. I think the modern view now of Marxists is knowledge is not just a reflection, but the outcome of a mental process. So when we have mental processes like we're doing now, like I'm doing now, like you're doing by thinking, labor power transforms this knowledge into, as well as knowledge contained in computers and in books, into a new knowledge. So when I'm thinking, I'm perhaps creating a new idea like I'm discussing now, but that is a material process. It's not it's not a subjective process. It's not a mysterious process. It's synapses in my brain moving around, creating this transformation into some new knowledge. So all knowledge is material, and it's a key point. If all knowledge is material, then all the work that we do is mental labor, whether it's on computers, whether it's writing things down rather than producing anything in a manual sense of physical things, these things still are material and they still are capable of creating value. So knowledge creates value. It's only by accepting that knowledge is material that it's possible to say that the production of knowledge can also be the production of value and surplus value for capitalists. Mental labor, just as much as physical labor, creates value. And that's very important because some people argue that these mental thoughts don't create any value, capitalism has no role in them, and that they're not relevant to our understanding of the capitalist production process. I think in the world of the 21st century, we can see that that cannot be the case, and that mental labor is just as much can create value, and therefore it being exploited by capital just as much as manual labor. And of course, once we move into the world of AI, where we begin to see the process where human intelligence is creating machines that perhaps can dramatically increase the productivity of knowledge around the world to make profits for capitalism, we enter a whole new contradiction that's coming about in the question of common ownership and planning to reduce the hours of human labor for all, as opposed to expanding the exploitation of workers through machinery-like and machine learning machines like AI. So that's really the central points that I wanted to present on the question of Lenin's economics. And we've got a little bit longer than I should have done. Apologies for that. But I hope we can at least have some time to deal with some of the questions that you might want to make, but also the things that I've missed.
Absolutely don't apologize. There was no way I was going to cut you off. I think that was like a really, really interesting and really accessible presentation of some quite hefty topics and concepts. And I think and the knowledge section at the end, I think you're right. I think there hasn't been much thought or discussion in those terms. So I think that was a really useful point to end on. And quickly gonna give Michael like 30 seconds to take a glass of water and to recover. But just say thanks to everyone who has tuned in so far, including so we've got people tuning in from Nottinghamshire, London, Clydebank, Derby, Wales, Paisley, Manchester, and then we've also got a number of international attendees as well, including from Malaysia and Belgium. So hello to everyone. There was a few different questions on quite sort of like diverse different bits have come in. So I'm going to just do like the first one because I think it's a bit standalone, first of all, which is we live in a time of, an era of permanent war, as sort of the daily headlines from the onslaught on Gaza show. Could Michael elaborate more on why Lenin thought capitalism inevitably meant war? So if we maybe do that one first, and then there's, if you answer that one, and then there's a couple of others that I can ask afterwards.
Well, there's always been war where elites are concerned. For the history of not just capitalism, but a history of our human society after the primitive communist societies that developed into class societies, meant that the ruling classes of those societies were prepared to go to war on many occasions in order to preserve their position, not only against their own people, that's a civil war, but also against other elites that they had to compete with over resources and over people, whether it was slaves or whether it was nature. And but what we see under capitalism is as it were, an acceleration of that process of how war plays a part in providing the control of the surplus for the ruling elites. And in our modern 21st century imperialist world, we now see that it's on an international scale. It's not just local disputes in different parts of the world, regional, those they still go on in big numbers, but the regional disputes are very much almost proxies of a struggle between the imperialist powers, but also between the imperialist powers as a bloc now in the 21st century and those powers, whether capitalist or otherwise, who do not accept the interests and the policies and the approach of the imperialist bloc. So in the 21st century, we're moving in a different way. We have a situation where perhaps in the mid to late 20th century, it was a battle between two great powers, the US as the great major hegemonic capitalist power and imperialist power, with everybody else out of the range, and the Soviet Union seen as the main enemy to imperialism. Now we have in the 21st century a much more complicated arrangement where the imperialist bloc is solidifying behind the Americans in order to try and block, crush, and strangle those powers that are not prepared to accept imperialist interests and control. Of course, we mean by that Russia, China, and of course, struggles for national liberation or for working class change in many countries is also an obstacle to US imperialism and the bloc. And so we see a horrendous situation in Gaza where Israel is playing the role of preserving imperialism's position in the Middle East and in terms of destroying Palestinian independence and Palestinians in general. So war has always been there, but in capitalism and imperialism is accelerating that process so that every day there is a war somewhere. And that's not going to go away. And Lenin made that point, I think, in Imperialism. There will always be war while imperialism continues to exist, while capitalism continues to exist. And it will be a struggle even after the defeat of many capitalist powers to try and preserve powers of states and working class people fighting for their own governments against imperialism.
Thank you. Now, there's a very specific one, but I think is quite interesting. I'll do a couple now all together and you can race through them all. So from Bronwyn on YouTube, how does Bitcoin fit into the Labour theory of value? One from Jude saying, hello from Birmingham. I think the main problem with capitalism is greed. How much money does one person need? I think that's actually like a question about what society we want. And then on a very different sort of topic, could Michael expand more on the difference between a transitional economy, as Lenin understood the Soviet economy, and a future international socialist economy? So I think that will enable us to finish on a upbeat, hopefully, hopeful ending. So before I come back to you, I'm just going to do a quick plug and my concluding remarks so that you get the final say. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come. I think this has been an hour really, really well spent, just completely really useful and brilliant and interesting. I'm going to encourage you to share the event after it's finished, share the YouTube link, send it on to people, share it in your WhatsApp groups of political activists, family, friends, anyone you know. Please do make a donation if you can afford it to Arise to help us continue like having events like this and to help support their YouTube channel. Buy a ticket for the Lenin 100 series if you can afford it. That would also be very much appreciated because like digital infrastructure costs as well as physical infrastructure. So hosting digital meetings does come with a cost. So it's really appreciated if you can help, if you are able. So I will now throw back over to Michael for the concluded, for your like sort of sum up to those questions I asked you, and any final
Can you remind me the second question? It's gone out of my head.
So the second question was from Jude in Birmingham, which was the main problem with capitalism is greed. How much money does one person require?
Yes. How could I forget that?
Exactly.
Well, let me deal with Bitcoin first. People will know that this is this digital currency. So it's not physical. It's one of those mental things we've just been talking about, which you can buy and sell on the market if you want. These coins are created by what they call miners who are producing Bitcoins when the process of the formulation, the logic of the coding goes through to produce this. And people are buying and selling these things. Is this, well, the first question, is it a coin? Well, is it money then? No, it's not really money. If you think about it, I can't really, and you can't, on the whole, use Bitcoin to buy anything much at all, if at all. Secondly, you can't store it except, well, you can store it, but it's usually in a Bitcoin fund or something. Who knows what will happen to that? And it doesn't really provide any international transactions or daily transactions you can use. And the volatility of the price of the Bitcoin, and that gives it away, it's priced usually in dollars. So really what people are thinking about is how much is my Bitcoin worth in dollars? Just like how much was my house or my flat or my stock market control assets, how much are they worth in dollars? So everything really still revolves around the major currencies of the world for transactions. So Bitcoin is not money really. It might have been the hope of the people who developed it originally, but it's really just another speculative asset. So it doesn't create any value. It really is trying to usurp or control certain sections of value created by workers. So switching it from dollars to pounds to Bitcoin to renminbi is all part of the same speculative process in currencies which go on amongst financial investors. This isn't creating any more value. It's merely shifting the value between the owners of those things. So it's an asset that is speculative. It can be dangerous because if lots of people invest in this and then it all collapses, just like anything else, that can lead huge losses and perhaps even hit people's living standards and jobs. But don't expect Bitcoin to replace anything we have already and make much of a difference. Investing in Bitcoin is a bit like another greedy activity. The aim is to, what do we mean by greed, at least under capitalism? What we mean is that capitalism works on the motive of trying to make a profit. It's trying to get more money from less money. How does it do that? Mainly capitalists do that by building plants and employing workers to produce things which they sell on the market. But also they get it through bankers and financial things by just buying and selling money and Bitcoin and other things to try and make money out of money. So the whole process of capitalism is not to produce things that people need. Yes, they have to produce things that people need, otherwise nobody would buy them because people needs have to be met. But they only produce as much or as what we want if it makes a profit. So capitalists find producing missiles and doing advertising and buying and selling profit much more profitable than producing basic social needs that we need in housing, education, health, and so on. There, capitalism doesn't find that quite so profitable and is not so interested in it and tries to avoid spending any money on it through taxation and so on. So capitalism is a system of greed in that sense, or a system of production for profit, if to be more accurate. And until we change that system, then greed and profit and inequalities will remain. Finally, question of transitional economy. Well, everybody out there, this is such a big question. I can only briefly put it together in a few sentences. That if you think about it, if we get rid of capitalism in Britain or in any one country, what do I mean by that? I mean that we have a workers' government comes to power. It basically takes over the major industries, brings them into public ownership, including the banks, and then it builds a plan for a public investment to meet the needs of people away from the things that capitalists want to make, so that now the decisions on investment, on production, on employment are increasingly in the hands of the working people through their government and through a planned economy based on public ownership. So that gets rid of the capitalist class in a sense. They're no longer in control. There might still be some of them left, but they're not in control of the economy. So we no longer have a capitalist economy. But do we have a socialist economy? No, we don't have socialism yet. In my view, you can't have socialism in one country. Also, you can't have it just at that beginning, because what does socialism mean? Socialism means doing away with all the scarcity and difficulties that workers have to survive, that we have a society generally of abundance where basically all the basic needs of society are met, and they're not met through a market by buying and selling. They're met by the state being able to provide you with housing for free, transport for free, employment will come to bring about the housing and transport and health, and all the basic social needs will be directly sent to you through production by the organizations of production that have been developed by the state. The market disappears. How do we pay for that? Well, we pay for that because workers produce the value and they're working in those industries to produce it. So it is a direct production process which does away with the market. And that wouldn't exist and couldn't exist in one country. Finish on this point, that if Britain had a socialist government like I've just briefly described and came into office, would it then have socialism? No, it is surrounded by imperialist countries, just as Russia was in 1917. Without the spreading of that socialist government to all those other countries, particularly the United States, then we cannot possibly begin to develop a workers' government on a world scale. So to start with, we need a transition towards the workers' government on a world scale. And only then can we move to the transition towards a socialist society where things are produced to meet people's social need and not produced for profit. So it's a process of transition. It doesn't happen overnight, but we can get rid of capitalist power to begin with, and then we can move over a period of time towards socialism on a world scale for the 8 billion people in the world and nature in harmony.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this afternoon. That's such a great point to end on. And I just want to thank you and everyone else who has joined us this afternoon again. And I will close the session there. Thank you ever so much to everyone.